the men who came out on top in the struggle for survival would be ruthless, brutal, barbarian, savage, and predatory. And so this is the understanding people began to have in terms of a secular definition of the masculine character. Instead of urging men to live up to the image of God in them, they began to urge men to live down to the beast within.
What you have done here is very important. You give us the intellectual background for understanding masculinity and how Christianity uniquely and utterly reconciles the sexes. So my first question, of course, is why did you choose to write this book of all the things you might have written about?
Well, my eye was certainly caught by how incredibly hostile our culture has become to masculinity. The Washington Post had an article titled, "Why Can't We Hate Men?" And that was my wake-up call. I said, wait, in a respected mainstream publication like this, a Huffington Post editor tweeted hashtag kill all men. And you can buy T-shirts that say, so many men, so little ammunition. And there are books with titles that are very blunt, like I Hate Men and No Good Men and Are Men Necessary? So this is what I wanted to get to the bottom of. Where is this coming from? You can't really stand against a social trend unless you know where it came from and how it developed. And then there were even men jumping on the bandwagon. A fairly well-known male author wrote a book in which he said, talking about healthy masculinity is like talking about healthy cancer. And then one more, which you may have seen, it's not in the book because it came out more recently, but the director of the movie Avatar, James Cameron, was in the news because he said testosterone is a toxin that you have to work out of your system. So my initial reason for writing the book was I just wanted to understand where is this coming from and how can we counter it more effectively.
Well, it's interesting. I obviously this has been in the culture for quite some time, and it's gotten particularly pointed in more recent years. But a number of years ago, my sense of this led me to write a book called Seven Men, and the way I dealt with it, which is just to tell to give seven short biographies of seven, in my estimation, great men, and what it is that's uniquely great about them and about their manliness. And then I wrote a book about seven women, and it's the same thing. What made these seven women great is clearly comes out of their being women. And so we're seeing an attack on the one hand on men, we're seeing an attack on women. It's an attack on the image of God, and it's an attack on God. There's no question in my mind that this is all an attack on God. But I'm so glad that you focused. I mean, you've really homed in on various aspects of this war on masculinity in the book and on the roots. So why don't we start with how this developed? Because a lot of people have this, I think a lot of people don't really understand how this has been worked out in history. You know, what was a man and a father in the 19th century, for example, and how that led to, and you deal with that in the book wonderfully. So why don't we start there?
A lot of people would say, oh, well, this hostility to masculinity perhaps came out of the 1960s, second wave feminism, but it actually started much further back. And this was a surprise when I started researching the book. You have to go all the way back to the Industrial Revolution, because prior to that, men worked with their husbands, men worked with their wives and their children all day on the family farm, the family industry, the family business. And so the cultural expectation on men focused much more on their caretaking role. In fact, here's a historical fact that was very surprising. Most of the books and literature written on parenting back then addressed fathers. If you go in a typical bookstore today, they're mostly addressed to mothers. But back then, fathers did spend just as much time with their children as mothers did. And I love it when even secular historians bring out the Christian perspective that was very strong in the colonial era. So one historian says, masculine virtue was defined as duty to God and man. So that sense of duty, where did we lose that? Well, it really started with the Industrial Revolution because it took work out of the home. And of course, men had to follow their work out of the home. And for the first time, they're working in factories and offices. They're not working with people they love and have a moral bond with their families. And that's when you see the literature start to change. People started to protest. They didn't like what they were seeing. They began to protest that men were becoming individualistic, egocentric, self-interested, greedy, and acquisitive. I'm using the language of the day, and even making their career into an idol. That was the language you saw. I thought that was fascinating. Many people said men are starting to make their idol, their career success, their financial achievements. So this was the first time negative language was applied to the male character. And of course, if the problem was men getting disconnected from their families, that does suggest what the most important solution is, which is reconnecting men to their families, which I have a whole chapter on that as well. But that's how far back you really have to go to find people very explicitly arguing that the male character has become degraded. And the language surprised me because it's almost as much as hostile as what we see today.
But what's interesting to me is how it's anybody who has a biblical worldview understands this is perfectly unbiblical. The idea to demonize any group, it's exactly like racism. To demonize men, to demonize women, to suggest that they are intrinsically flawed is a satanic project. And we're seeing it happen. Obviously, we're seeing it happen with men, but we're seeing the same thing happen with really the erasure of women. And ultimately, it's an attack on God and God's view of men and women.
Well, exactly. Even in the 19th century, since you asked the historical question, you see people start to say, the father is the prototype of God in the family. And yet, all of a sudden, he's not here. We're used to being men being out of the home all day. But back then, it was a shock. Like, where are the fathers? The leading psychologist of the day said, our boys are now half orphaned because their fathers were not in the home.
Folks, I hate to interrupt, but I just don't want you to miss any of the content we're putting out on here. We've just got some amazing stuff. So would you do yourself a favor and hit the subscribe button so we can make sure you don't miss anything? I promise you, great stuff coming up. Hit the subscribe button. Thank you.
This is also the period when America began to secularize. Before that, when work was done in the home, there was no public-private divide. But now that when work was taken out of the home, this is also the development of large public institutions like business and financial institutions and the universities and the state. And people began to argue that these large public institutions should operate by scientific principles, by which they really meant value-free.
That is, I have to say, that is one of the points you make in the book. And again, I want to recommend the book. It's called The Toxic War on Masculinity. But you, by bringing this out, this is a stunning, really stunning discovery in a sense, to say, aha, look what happened. For the first time, we have the development of this secular sphere. And it's not as though anyone planned it, but it just happens. And obviously, we are living with the result of that. I mean, the world of business, the world of just the world outside of the home. Suddenly, you have it in the 19th century competing with the home. That to me is a major piece that I've not heard anyone besides you say. In all these discussions of how we got here.
Yes, and as the masculine character was secularized, as men were the ones, they were working in the secular realm, they were getting that secular education. And so people began to redefine masculinity in secular terms. One of the biggest stepping, through the book, I go through various stages, but one of the most important was the rise of Darwinian evolution. And that's surprising because most people think, well, that's about science. But it actually had a huge impact on the secular definition of masculinity. Darwinian thinkers began to say the men who came out on top in the struggle for survival would be ruthless, brutal, barbarian, savage, and predatory. And so this is the understanding people began to have in terms of a secular definition of the masculine character. Instead of urging men to live up to the image of God in them, they began to urge men to live down to the beast within. That was their favorite phrase. In other words, what many people today are protesting is not the biblical view of masculinity, it's the secular view of masculinity, and especially the secular view that was inspired by evolutionary thought. And it's still with us today. It's not called social Darwinism anymore, it's called evolutionary psychology, but it still says the same thing. There's a best-selling book called The Moral Animal. And the author says, and this is a direct quote, "The human male is a possessive, oppressive, flesh-obsessed pig. Telling a man how to have a good marriage is like telling a Viking how not to pillage." And I thought, really? You can get away with this kind of negative language to men? And there's a recent book, another one, this is actually an older book that was just reissued by, you may know it because it's by George Gilder. But George Gilder says it as well. He says that by nature, men are violent, irresponsible, and sexually predatory. Their deepest yearning is to escape to a primal mode of, let me see what he says, primal mode of predatory and immediate gratification. And so this is why people protest against a kind of toxic version of masculinity.
Right.
It's because the secular version of masculinity has become so negative.
Well, it's a little complicated in the sense that George Gilder, he's getting at some things that there's truth there. In other words, apart from God, apart from, the domestic influence of a wife, oftentimes that is where men go. And it's why, God wants us typically to be in a marriage, because there's something that men do for women and something that women do for men that's beautiful, and it's God ordained. And so when you talk about men suddenly finding themselves away from their families most of the time, in a secular environment, and in an environment filled with other men. In other words, there's something there when you think about what happens sociologically, the idea that men are not spending time with wife and kids in the home environment, but are suddenly now in this environment with other men most of the time. That's also a strange development, and it really led to, I think it's it was self-reinforcing in a sense. It creates this separation, or it creates a kind of an environment where men maybe begin looking down on women or begin treating them because they're not around them as much. This kind of hyper-masculine society develops. In other words, there are truths there, so it's a little bit complicated. But what's wrong about it is it's a fatalistic, unbiblical view of who men are.
Yes, and about the end of the 19th century, what happened is men began to say, well, this is just who we are. Before that, the biblical view held enough sway that men still felt, okay, my behavior needs to change. I need to live up to a biblical concept of masculinity. But then as the culture secularized, that's when men began to say, well, what we now have is the Andrew Tate phenomenon, right? Fast cars, fast money, fast women. And Andrew Tate specifically says, I'm a pimp. I produce pornography. And women need to understand that men are just naturally sexually promiscuous, and they just need to accept that. So that's where the beginning of the Andrew Tate phenomenon comes from. And by the way, even Christian men are being drawn into it. I have a former graduate student who now teaches high school. And she said, all of my male students are fans of Andrew Tate.
Yeah.
They're even putting Andrew Tate quotes in the yearbook. I said, where do you teach? She's at a classical Christian school.
Yeah.
So if churches are not giving men a strong, healthy, biblical model of masculinity, they are reaching out to these online influencers who are teaching a very secularized view. And that's why it's so important for us to get the biblical view out there, competing with it, so that even our Christian young men are not reaching out to the Andrew Tates of the world.